My brother was dying in a hospice bed. For 5 agonizing days, he could not speak a single word. But every time his son entered the room, sheer, unfiltered fear filled his sunken eyes. The very last thing he managed to write on a crumpled piece of paper, slipping it into my hand, with the last ounce of his strength, was just 2 words. Not Cale. An hour later, my brother was gone, and suddenly those 2 bizarre words made terrifying sense. Before I dive into exactly what happened, and how I made my nephew pay for his greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart family members who completely underestimated you. The room smelled of bleach and fading life. It is a scent you never forget once you experience it. I sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair in the corner, staring at the rhythmic rise and fall of my brother Dennis's chest. I am Bruce. I am 70 years old, a retired contractor who has spent his entire life turning blueprints into concrete realities. Dennis and I were more than just brothers. We were partners. We grew up with nothing, sharing a cramped bedroom in a drafty house, learning early on that if we wanted anything in this world, we had to build it with our own 2 hands, and build it we did. But looking at him now, hooked up to a symphony of beeping monitors and oxygen tubes, you would never guess the titan he used to be. The door swung open, shattering the quiet dignity of the room. My nephew Jared walked in, followed closely by his wife Monica. Jared wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first truck. Monica trailed behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum, a designer handbag clutched tightly under her arm. They did not walk over to the bed. They did not ask the attending nurse how Dennis was feeling, if he was in pain or if he needed water. Jared marched straight up to the nurse's station just outside the open door. I could hear every word. He wanted to know exactly when the Medicare coverage for the private room was going to cut off. He wanted to know the daily out-of-pocket rate if Dennis lingered past the weekend. Monica stood beside him, checking her phone, looking profoundly inconvenienced by the whole ordeal of watching her father-in-law die. I sat silently in my corner, wearing a faded flannel shirt, denim jeans, and my scuffed work boots. I watched them with a quiet, burning intensity. To Jared and Monica, I was just Uncle Bruce, the broke retired carpenter who never amounted to much. They viewed me as a relic, an uneducated blue-collar worker who barely scraped by on a meager pension, while Dennis lived in a massive house and seemingly held all the wealth. What Jared and Monica did not know, what nobody knew, was the truth about our empire. Decades ago, Dennis and I built a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio from the ground up. We bought abandoned lots, flipped them, built shopping plazas, and leased office spaces. But back in the late 90s, a subcontractor tried to hit me with a massive, frivolous lawsuit that threatened to drain everything we had worked for. To protect our assets, I legally transferred my entire half of the portfolio into Dennis's name. It was a shield, a brotherly agreement bound by absolute trust. For 30 years, Dennis legally held the title to everything, but we split the profits down the middle. Jared looked at me and saw a failure. He had no idea that I was the co-architect of the fortune he was drooling over. Jared finally finished his financial interrogation with the nurse and stepped into the room. He glanced at me, his lip curling into a barely concealed sneer. He checked his expensive wristwatch, sighed, and crossed his arms. "Uncle Bruce," he said, his voice dripping with false patience. "Monica and I really need some private family time with Dad. We need to say our goodbyes. I think it is best if you step out for a while." It was a dismissal. A disrespectful, callous order to vacate the room of the brother I had stood beside for 70 years. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest, hot and heavy, but I swallowed it. Causing a scene over a dying man's bed was not my style. I slowly pushed myself up from the vinyl chair, my knees popping slightly in the quiet room. I walked over to the side of the bed to look at Dennis one last time. His eyes were closed, his skin pale and thin like parchment paper. I leaned in close. "I will be right outside, Denny," I whispered. Just as I turned to pull away, Dennis's eyes shot wide open. They were wide with a raw, unadulterated terror that froze the blood in my veins. Suddenly, his skeletal hand shot out from under the thin hospital blanket. He grabbed my wrist. The strength in his grip was shocking, desperate, like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. He pulled me down closer to him. Jared stepped forward immediately, his voice raising in panic. "Hey, what is he doing? Let go of him, Dad." But Dennis ignored his son. With trembling fingers, he shoved a small, tightly crumpled piece of paper deep into the palm of my hand. He squeezed my fingers shut over it, holding my gaze with an intensity that burned into my soul. His breathing became erratic, the monitors beside the bed beginning to beep rapidly in warning. Jared was practically shouting now, grabbing my shoulder and physically pulling me away from the bed. "You are stressing him out. Get out, Uncle Bruce. Get out right now and let the nurses do their jobs." I stumbled back, my hand firmly clenched into a fist. Medical staff rushed past me into the room, responding to the blaring alarms. I backed out into the brightly lit hallway, the heavy wooden door swinging shut in my face, cutting off the chaotic sounds of the room. I stood alone under the flickering fluorescent lights, my chest heaving. I opened my hand and stared at the crumpled piece of paper. It was a torn corner of a napkin, likely snatched from his dinner tray. I carefully smoothed it out. In jagged, frantic, barely legible handwriting written in a weak blue ink were two words: "Not Cale." I stared at the paper, my mind racing. Not Cale. What on earth did that mean? For the past few weeks, Jared had been making a big show to the nurses about bringing his father homemade organic kale smoothies to help with his digestion. It was a weird detail, something Jared constantly bragged about, to prove what an attentive son he was. Was Dennis trying to tell me the smoothies were making him sick? Was he allergic? It did not make sense. You do not look at your brother with absolute mortal terror in your eyes to complain about a vegetable. I leaned against the cold hospital wall, folding the tiny note and slipping it deep into the front pocket of my jeans. I waited in that hallway, staring at the floor tiles, praying for Dennis to stabilize. But the universe had other plans. Exactly 1 hour later, the door opened. A doctor stepped out, looking exhausted, followed by a weeping Monica. Jared stepped into the hallway a moment later. He buried his face in his hands, letting out loud theatrical sobs for the benefit of the medical staff lingering nearby. The nurses offered their condolences, speaking in soft, hushed tones, placing comforting hands on Jared's shoulders. I stood completely still, a hollow ache opening up in my chest. My brother, my partner, my best friend was gone. As soon as the doctor and the nurses walked away down the corridor to file the paperwork, the atmosphere shifted. It was immediate and jarring. Jared dropped his hands from his face. His eyes were completely dry. There was not a single trace of grief on his features. The weeping, devastated son vanished, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating businessman. He straightened his expensive tie, cleared his throat, and turned to look at me. His posture was rigid, projecting an authority he thought he possessed. "Uncle Bruce," he said, his voice flat and transactional. "Dad is gone. It is a tragedy, but we have to be practical now. I will be taking the keys to Dad's house immediately. I also need you to go to the property and box up all the estate documents, deeds, and bank statements you can find. I am coming by tomorrow to collect them. We need to secure all the assets right now before probate complicates things." I looked at him, truly looked at him. His father's body was not even cold yet in the room behind him, and he was already trying to stake his claim on the kingdom. He was demanding the keys to the house. He was demanding the paperwork. I was treating me like a hired hand, an errand boy whose only purpose was to facilitate his inheritance. The rage I had swallowed earlier roared back to life, threatening to spill out of my mouth. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his custom suit. I wanted to slam him against the hallway wall and remind him exactly who I was. I wanted to tell him that half of everything his father owned belonged to me, but then I remembered the note in my pocket. Not Cale. Dennis was terrified of him. Dennis wanted me to know something was profoundly wrong. If I blew up now, if I showed Jared my hand, I would lose the element of surprise. Jared thought I was weak. He thought I was stupid. And right now, that was my greatest advantage. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the tension out of my shoulders. I let my posture slump, playing the part of the grieving, defeated old man he expected me to be. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against Dennis's final warning, and pulled out my keychain. I detached the heavy brass key to Dennis's front door and held it out to him. "You are right, Jared," I said, making my voice sound weak and submissive. "We need to be practical. I will head over to the house and get the paperwork boxed up for you." Jared snatched the key from my hand, a smug, victorious smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good," he replied. "See that you do." He turned on his heel and walked down the hallway, with Monica already pulling his cell phone out of his pocket to make a call. I watched them walk away, my hand shoved deep into my pocket, gripping the crumpled piece of paper. Jared thought he had won. He thought he was taking control of the empire. He had no idea he had just declared war on the architect. 3 days passed in a blur of forced silence. The funeral was held on a Tuesday morning. It was a bleak and gray day. A fine mist hung in the air, covering the city in a damp chill. I stood in the back of the generic funeral home Jared had chosen. It was a discount parlor located in a strip mall off the highway. The carpet smelled of cheap cleaning chemicals and old dust. The lighting was harsh and yellow, casting a sickly glow over everything. My brother Dennis was a man who owned entire city blocks. He had built massive shopping centers and high-rise office buildings. He had millions of dollars sitting in secure bank accounts. Yet here he was, laying inside the cheapest veneer casket Jared could find in the catalog. The handles were plastic painted to look like brass. The lining was stiff synthetic fabric. It was a massive insult to a man who had provided so much for his family. Jared had intentionally locked me out of every single arrangement. When I called him the morning after Dennis passed to ask about the church service, he told me it was already handled. He said they wanted to keep expenses down to protect the estate assets. He said a quiet and fast service was what his father would have wanted. It was an absolute lie. Dennis loved the grand old cathedral downtown. We had donated heavily to the restoration of its stained glass windows just 10 years ago, but Jared did not want to pay for the cathedral. He wanted the process over as quickly as possible so he could focus on the money. I was treated like an unwanted guest at my own brother's memorial. I was not asked to speak. I was not asked to serve as a pallbearer. I was directed to sit in the third row, behind distant cousins and casual business acquaintances. I sat there looking at the fake wood grain of the casket, feeling a profound and heavy sorrow. The reception was held in a cramped back room of the funeral parlor. They served stale coffee and dry cookies on flimsy paper plates. The room was crowded with people from our past. I saw old contractors we used to work with in the early days. I saw bankers who had financed our first major commercial developments. I saw the architects who had helped us design the downtown plaza. These were men who knew Dennis well. They were men who respected the massive empire we had built together from nothing. But every time I tried to approach them, to share a memory or shake a hand, Jared would smoothly step in front of me. He played the part of the grieving but highly responsible son to absolute perfection. He would place a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder and gently guide me away from the important conversations. He would lean in and whisper to the bankers and the architects. He made sure his voice was just loud enough for me to hear from a few feet away. He would say things like, "Poor Uncle Bruce is having a really hard time today." He would say, "Is simply not what it used to be." He would shake his head sadly and tell them that his father had been financially supporting me for decades. He painted a detailed picture of me as a pathetic and useless dependent. He told the men who had literally watched me pour concrete and negotiate complex zoning laws that I was just a broke retired carpenter who relied entirely on family charity. I stood by the cheap folding tables and drank the terrible coffee. I watched Jared shake hands and exchange business cards. He was actively cementing the narrative that he was the sole heir and the new king of the empire. He was erasing my legacy right in front of my eyes. He wanted everyone in that room to believe that he was the brilliant businessman stepping up to manage his father's vast wealth. And the worst part was that the men in the tailored suits believed him. They looked at my faded suit and my scuffed work boots, and they believed every single word Jared said. They offered me looks of deep, uncomfortable pity. Pity is a bitter thing to swallow when you know you hold the deed to the building they are standing in. But I swallowed it. I played the part perfectly. I let my shoulders slump, and I kept my mouth shut tightly. Then I saw Monica. She walked into the reception room halfway through the dreary event. She was holding a plastic cup of water and chatting loudly with one of her friends. She was not crying. She was not grieving. She was holding court. She wore a tailored black dress that looked expensive and brand new. But it was not the dress that caught my attention and made my blood run cold. It was the heavy gold and emerald necklace resting against her collarbone. My breath caught in my throat. That necklace had belonged to my late sister-in-law. It was a custom piece Dennis had commissioned for their 20th wedding anniversary. The emeralds were flawless and bright green. It was the most prized possession in our entire family. Dennis had always said the necklace was meant to be passed down properly when the time was right. It was supposed to be a sacred family heirloom kept safe in the bank vault. Monica was wearing it casually at a discount funeral parlor. She was parading it in front of the grieving guests. She touched the emeralds constantly, making sure the harsh overhead light caught the stones so everyone would notice. She was marking her territory. She was wearing the spoils of war before the dirt was even tossed onto my brother's grave. It was an act of supreme visual arrogance. She looked at me from across the room. She saw me staring at the necklace. She did not look away or show an ounce of shame. Instead, she offered me a tight and victorious smile. She raised her chin slightly and patted the emeralds. She wanted me to know that she and Jared had already raided the house. She wanted me to know they had already gone through my brother's private safe. My hands shook, holding my paper cup. I wanted to walk across the cheap carpet and rip the necklace right off her throat. I wanted to tell the entire room that those jewels were bought with money I had earned with my own sweat. I wanted to scream that the wealth they were all salivating over belonged solely to me. The anger was a living thing inside my chest. It clawed at my ribs. It demanded to be let out into the open. But I remembered the terror in my brother's eyes. I remembered the desperate grip of his hand and the crumpled note he had forced into my palm. I knew that losing my temper would give Jared exactly what he wanted. It would completely prove his false narrative. It would make me look like an unstable and bitter old man making wild claims about fortunes he did not possess. Jared would use my anger to have me legally removed from the premises. He would use it to discredit me completely in front of the people who mattered, so I remained silent. I forced my shaking hands to hold still. I took a slow sip of the cold coffee. I watched my nephew and his wife parade around the room like royalty holding court among the peasants. They were celebrating a victory they believed was absolute and final. They were dividing up an empire they did not build and spending wealth they did not own. Jared eventually walked over to me. He checked his phone and sighed, looking profoundly bored by the memorial service he had orchestrated. The room was starting to clear out. The bankers and the architects were leaving to go back to their comfortable offices. The final phase of his plan was about to begin. He looked at me with a cold and calculating stare. He was getting ready to make his next move. He was getting ready to throw me out into the street, and I was getting ready to let him try. The last few guests were finally filtering out the heavy glass doors of the funeral parlor to escape the gloomy afternoon rain. I stood alone near the folding tables watching the cleaning crew start to gather up the half-empty coffee cups. That is when Jared made his move. He did not walk over to me like a grieving nephew seeking comfort. He approached me with the brisk, heavy steps of an executive stepping into a boardroom to fire a subordinate. Monica lingered a few paces behind him, with her arms crossed over her chest, the emerald necklace catching the dull light. She was acting as his silent enforcer. Jared stopped just inches from me, invading my personal space to make me feel small. He reached inside the breast pocket of his expensive, tailored suit jacket. He did not offer a handshake or a word of sympathy. He pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope and shoved it directly against my chest, forcing me to take it. I looked down at the heavy paper in my calloused hands. It felt completely out of place at a funeral reception. I slowly peeled back the flap and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. The bold black letters at the top of the very first page jumped out and hit me like a physical blow. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate, an eviction notice for my own house. I stood there staring at the address printed on the cruel legal document. It was the modest 3-bedroom ranch house I had lived in for the past 25 years. It was the house where I had built every single cabinet by hand, where I had carefully planted the oak tree in the front yard. But technically, strictly on paper, the deed was registered in Dennis's name as part of the massive asset protection strategy we had set up decades ago. Jared watched my eyes scan the terrible document. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted me to explode. I wanted me to yell and scream and make a scene so he could call the funeral parlor staff to have the crazy old uncle escorted out. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my hands to remain perfectly still. I slowly looked up from the paper and met his cold, arrogant stare. I did not say a word. I just waited for him to deliver the speech he had clearly rehearsed. Jared smirked, a cruel twisting of his lips that made him look completely unrecognizable from the little boy I used to take fishing. "It is nothing personal, Bruce," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He did not even call me uncle anymore. "The property now belongs to KALE Holdings LLC. As the new managing director, I have a fiduciary duty to maximize the portfolio. We are liquidating all the outdated, non-performing assets. That house is sitting on prime residential real estate, and it is time to sell. You have 30 days to get your tools and your junk out of the garage." Monica let out a soft, mocking laugh from behind him. Jared buttoned his suit jacket, looking profoundly pleased with himself. "It is just business," he added, turning on his heel to walk away. I stood frozen in the middle of that empty room as the sheer gravity of his words crashed over me. KALE Holdings LLC. The letters echoed in my mind. Kale. Suddenly, the air was sucked right out of my lungs. The crumpled, torn piece of napkin, hidden deep in my pocket, felt like it was burning a hole straight through the heavy denim fabric. Not kale. My brother was not warning me about the green health smoothies Jared claimed to be bringing him every single morning. Those smoothies were just a cover story. A sick, twisted joke Jared was playing on the nursing staff to look like a devoted son. KALE stood for Keystone Assets Legal Enterprises. It was a fraudulent shell company. It all clicked together with terrifying clarity. Jared had brought legal documents disguised in a briefcase into that sterile hospice room. He had waited until Dennis was heavily medicated, pumped full of strong painkillers, and morphine, unable to speak or defend himself. Jared had forced my dying brother to sign over his entire life's work. He had transferred the massive real estate portfolio we built together into this fake LLC. Dennis knew exactly what his son was doing, but he was trapped in a failing body, unable to scream for help. That sudden, terrifying grip on my wrist before he died was not just fear. It was a desperate plea for justice. Not Kale was a dying man begging his brother to look behind the curtain and expose the fraud. The depth of the betrayal made my stomach violently churn. My own nephew had watched his father gasping for air on his deathbed and saw nothing but a business transaction. He had placed a pen into a dying man's trembling hand and stolen a legacy. And now he was using that stolen power to throw me out onto the street. He assumed I was a gullible old carpenter who would just pack his bags and vanish quietly into the night. I thought I was ignorant of the corporate structures, the legal jargon, and the millions of dollars hiding behind the deeds. He was so completely blinded by his own greed that he never once considered why a supposedly broke man like me never asked his wealthy brother for a single dime. I looked down at the eviction notice again, gripping the edges so tightly my knuckles turned white. 30 days. Jared thought 30 days was a death sentence for me. He thought it was a ticking clock forcing me into a corner. But he did not realize he had just handed me a 30-day head start to dismantle his entire life. The sheer arrogance of his plan was its fatal flaw. By creating a shell company and forcefully transferring the assets under duress, he had activated the very trap Dennis and I had secretly built into the foundation of our empire all those years ago. I folded the eviction notice neatly and slid it into my pocket right next to Dennis's final desperate note. I did not shed a tear. The time for mourning my brother had passed. Now it was time to honor his final request. The man who stood in that funeral parlor was not a victim. I was the architect who laid the concrete and drafted the contracts that Jared was currently trying to steal. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold reality of the situation settle over me. I turned and walked out the glass doors of the funeral home, stepping out into the cold rain. I did not look back at Jared or Monica. They had made their move. The board was set. The game had officially begun, and they had absolutely no idea who they were playing against. I stood under the gray canvas awning of the funeral parlor. The cold rain blew sideways, soaking the shoulders of my old flannel jacket. Jared stood just a few feet away, safely tucked near the glass doors, completely dry in his expensive suit. He was waiting for the explosion. I could see the anticipation dancing in his dark eyes. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to curse his name and threaten to call the police right there in the parking lot. I was practically vibrating with the need to call the funeral home security and have his crazy, bitter uncle dragged off the property in front of the remaining guests. He needed me to act like a lunatic, so his false narrative would be absolutely perfect. He wanted everyone to see a crazy old man making wild accusations because he was simply too lazy to pack up his garage. I have poured concrete foundations that could withstand Category 5 hurricanes. I have negotiated massive commercial contracts with city planners who would sell their own mothers for a zoning permit. I knew how to hold my ground against predators. The urge to reach out and grab the lapels of his custom suit was almost overwhelming. I wanted to shake him until the absolute truth fell out of his mouth. I wanted to march him back inside the reception room and announce to the bankers and the architects exactly what he had done to his dying father. But a good contractor knows that you never strike a structural wall until you know exactly what is supporting it. If I hit him now, I would only break my own hand. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my 70 years on this earth. I swallowed my pride. I let it burn on the way down, burying it deep in my gut, where he could not see it. I closed my eyes for a brief second and completely changed my physical posture. I let the natural ache in my knees become more pronounced. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward, rounding my back, to shave a couple of inches off my height. I made my hands tremble just slightly as I reached into my damp pocket to put the eviction notice away right next to my brother's crumpled note. I looked down at the wet pavement, refusing to meet his arrogant gaze. I made myself look exactly like the broken, tired, irrelevant old man he believed I was. When I finally looked up at him, I made sure my eyes were wide and watery. I let my voice drop to a raspy, defeated whisper. "I understand, Jared," I said softly. The words tasted like dry ash in my mouth, but I forced them out perfectly. "I understand completely. I will start packing up the house tonight. I will not cause any trouble for you or Monica. You have my word." The physical transformation worked flawlessly. I watched the tension completely drain out of Jared's shoulders. The defensive, aggressive posture he had been holding completely evaporated into the damp air. He let out a short, breathy chuckle. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief mixed with overwhelming superiority. A smug smirk spread across his face, stretching from ear to ear. He actually stepped forward and reached out to pat my damp shoulder, treating me like an obedient dog that had just rolled over and exposed its belly. "That is the right attitude, Uncle Bruce," Jared said. His voice was dripping with fake sympathy and extreme condescension. "Like I said before, it is just business. Do not make it harder than it needs to be. Take whatever old furniture you want from the house. I am sure you can find a cheap apartment on the edge of town that will accept your monthly pension checks. Just make sure you leave the keys on the kitchen counter when you are done. The demolition contractors are coming in exactly 31 days to gut the place. We have a lot of properties to liquidate, and I cannot afford any delays with this new holding company. We are moving fast to maximize the portfolio." How is moving fast? Those words were absolute music to my ears. When greedy people move fast, they make monumental mistakes. They skip the fine print on the contracts. They bypass proper legal reviews. They forge documents in a hurry, and they leave massive digital footprints all over the place. Jared was so completely convinced of his own brilliance that he thought he was legally untouchable. He believed he was dealing with a simple, uneducated carpenter who barely understood how to use a smartphone, let alone a corporate bank account. He had no idea that I had spent the last 30 years navigating the most complex commercial real estate laws in the entire state. By playing the submissive fool, I had just given him the ultimate confidence to be sloppy. He would not hide his tracks because he truly believed nobody with any real power was looking. I gave him one last, slow, obedient nod. I turned away from the funeral parlor and walked out into the pouring rain. I did not rush. I dragged my heavy boots across the wet asphalt, letting him watch my pathetic retreat from the safety of the dry awning. I walked toward my rusted old pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot. I unlocked the heavy metal door, climbed onto the cracked vinyl seat, and shut the door firmly behind me, sealing myself inside the quiet cab. The rain drummed heavily against the metal roof, washing away the sounds of the funeral home. I sat there in the driver's seat for a long time. The defeated slump instantly vanished from my shoulders. I sat up perfectly straight, gripping the steering wheel. My brother Dennis always told me that the greatest advantage a man could have was being underestimated. He used to say that when the room thinks you are nobody, you can see exactly who everybody really is. Today, I was putting his philosophy to the ultimate test. I pulled the eviction notice and the torn napkin from my pocket and placed them carefully on the dashboard. Jared thought he had successfully buried his father and stolen a massive fortune in a single weekend. He thought he had outsmarted everyone in the family. But arrogance is a blinding fog. It keeps you from seeing the cliff edge right in front of your toes. I started the engine, listening to the old familiar rumble of the motor. I put the truck into gear and drove out of the parking lot into the storm. I was not driving home to pack my bags. I was driving straight to my lawyer's office. I drove my rusted pickup truck away from the discount funeral parlor, leaving Jared and Monica behind in their smug bubble of false victory. The heavy rain pounded against the windshield, blurring the gray streets of the city. For 30 years, I had played the role of the simple, quiet carpenter. I drove this beaten-down truck because it kept people from asking questions. But today, the squeaking brakes and the rattling engine felt different. They felt like the perfect camouflage. I navigated the truck onto the highway, heading straight toward the towering glass and steel skyline of the downtown financial district. The closer I got to the center of the city, the more the surroundings changed. The cheap strip malls faded into massive corporate high-rises and manicured corporate plazas. These were the exact buildings Dennis and I had purchased, developed, and leased. I pulled my battered truck into an exclusive underground parking garage, meant for executives driving luxury imported sedans. The parking attendant recognized my truck immediately. He did not ask for a ticket. He just nodded and opened the VIP gate. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor. The doors slid open silently, revealing the grand reception area of Maxwell and Associates. The floors were imported marble, and the walls were paneled in rich, dark walnut. It was a space designed to intimidate the weak and comfort the powerful. The receptionist looked up from her polished desk. When she saw my soaking wet flannel shirt and my muddy work boots, she did not reach for a security button. She immediately stood up and offered a respectful nod. "Mr. Maxwell cleared his afternoon schedule the moment we heard about your brother," she said, her voice soft and professional. "He is waiting for you in his personal office." I thanked her and walked down the long, silent corridor. I passed glass-walled conference rooms where junior partners were finalizing corporate mergers. None of them paid any attention to the old man in the wet jacket. That was exactly how I liked it. I opened the heavy solid oak door at the end of the hall and stepped inside. Mr. Maxwell was standing by his massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the rain-swept city. Arthur Maxwell was a brilliant, ruthless corporate attorney. He wore a pristine charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in a month. He was a shark in every sense of the word, but he was our shark. Dennis and I had hired him 20 years ago when he was just a hungry junior partner, and we had made him very wealthy. He turned around as I closed the door behind me. His sharp eyes scanned my wet clothes and my exhausted face. He walked over to his massive mahogany desk and gestured to a leather chair. "I am deeply sorry for your loss, Bruce," he said, his voice completely dropping the usual corporate edge. "Dennis was a brilliant man, and we are going to make sure his legacy is protected." I did not sit down in the leather chair. I walked right up to his immaculate mahogany desk. I took a deep breath and let the tired, broken old man persona completely fall away. I straightened my spine, standing up to my full height. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculated stillness. I reached into my damp pocket and pulled out the crisp white envelope Jared had shoved into my chest just an hour earlier. I tossed it onto the center of the polished wood desk. Then I reached back into my pocket and gently pulled out the torn, crumpled piece of a hospital napkin. I smoothed out the jagged edges with my thumbs and laid it down right next to the pristine legal document. Two pieces of paper that told a complete and terrifying story. Maxwell frowned and picked up the white envelope. He slid the eviction notice out and read the bold print. His eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He read the name of the new holding company out loud. Kale Holdings, LLC. He looked up at me, completely confused. He knew exactly what assets Dennis controlled, and he knew this company was never part of our legitimate portfolio. Then he looked down at the crumpled napkin resting on his desk. He read the two frantic words written in my dying brother's shaky blue ink. Not Kale. I watched the realization hit him. Arthur Maxwell was a man who handled billion-dollar mergers and complex international tax laws. It took him exactly 10 seconds to connect the dots. The color drained from his face, and he slowly set the eviction notice down. "Jared locked me out of the funeral arrangements," I told him, keeping my voice completely steady. "He isolated me from every single business associate at the reception. He made sure everyone in that room thought I was a pathetic dependent, relying on my brother's charity. And then he cornered me in the parking lot and handed me a 30-day notice to vacate my own house." I tapped my index finger against the crumpled napkin. Jared was bringing Dennis organic kale smoothies in the hospice room every single morning. He made a huge production out of it for the nurses, but Dennis was not complaining about the taste of the vegetables before he died. He was using his absolute last breath to warn me about the fraudulent shell company his son was using to steal our entire life's work. Jared brought legal documents into that hospice room, while Dennis was pumped full of morphine and forced him to sign away the empire. Maxwell stared at the documents on his desk for a long moment. He slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The silence in the massive office was heavy and thick with tension. When he finally looked back up at me, his eyes were cold and sharp. He was no longer looking at a grieving brother. He was looking at a client who had just declared war. "Bruce," he said softly, "if Jared executed a transfer of assets into a new LLC while Dennis was under hospice care and heavily medicated, that is a massive federal crime. It is elder abuse, wire fraud, and extreme forgery. We can call the authorities right now and have him arrested before dinner." I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. "Do not call the police yet. If we arrest him now, he will just hire a sleazy defense attorney and claim it was a misunderstanding. He will claim Dennis was lucid and wanted to consolidate the estate to save on taxes. He will drag this out in probate court for the next 10 years. I do not want to just stop him, Arthur. I want to completely dismantle him. I want him to feel the absolute peak of arrogance right before the floor falls out from under him. I want him to believe he is a king, so the fall destroys his entire foundation." Maxwell nodded slowly, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He reached out and carefully picked up the torn napkin, placing it inside a clear evidence folder. He then took the eviction notice and laid it flat on his desk, smoothing out the creases. He picked up his expensive fountain pen and looked at me with absolute predatory focus. "Tell me exactly what you want to do, Bruce," he said. I leaned over the mahogany desk, placing my hands flat on the polished wood. "I want you to pull up the original master trust agreements, Arthur. The ones we drafted 20 years ago. We are going to let Jared think he has won. We are going to let him liquidate assets and spend money he does not have. We are going to let him build his entire future on a foundation of sand. And then we are going to wash it all away." I spent the next 2 weeks surrounded by brown cardboard boxes and heavy rolls of packing tape. I bought the boxes from the local hardware store, making sure to park my rusted truck right up front where everyone in town could see me loading them into the truck bed. I needed the local gossip to spread quickly. I needed Jared to hear from his little neighborhood spies that his broken old uncle was obediently packing up his entire life without a single fight. The house was extremely quiet. The old oak tree in the front yard dropped its autumn leaves onto the wooden porch I had built with my own hands. Inside the house, I moved very slowly. I wrapped old coffee mugs in newspaper and packed away the framed photographs of me and Dennis fishing at the lake. Every time a car drove slowly past the house, I made sure I was completely visible through the large living room window. I would stand there holding a heavy box, looking totally exhausted and defeated. It was a flawless performance. It was the greatest acting job of my entire 70 years on Earth. Inside my chest, I was not defeated at all. I was sitting perfectly still in the center of a massive spider web, just waiting for the flies to completely tangle themselves in the sticky silk. My phone would buzz twice a day with private calls from Arthur Maxwell, giving me updates from his downtown law office. He had hired a specialized team of forensic accountants to track every single financial move Jared made. Jared was moving with blinding speed and absolute recklessness. He was acting exactly like a man who had just robbed a bank and desperately needed to launder the stolen money before the police arrived at his door. I was totally blinded by the millions of dollars he thought he finally controlled. The very first things to disappear were my brother Dennis's antique cars. Dennis truly loved his classic cars. He spent his weekends meticulously restoring them in his garage. He had a pristine 1969 Mach 1 Mustang and a fully restored 1957 Corvette. They were his absolute pride and joy. Maxwell informed me that Jared had listed both cars on a public online auction website. He did not even bother to have them professionally appraised by a vintage car expert. He listed them at fire sale prices just to get the cash immediately deposited into his accounts. He sold the beautiful Mustang to a private collector 3 states away for less than half of what the restored engine alone was actually worth. He just wanted the liquid cash hitting his bank account so he could finally feel like a wealthy man. It made me sick to my stomach to think about some stranger driving away with my brother's legacy, but Maxwell constantly reminded me to stay patient. We had to let the theft happen completely so the federal criminal charges would stick perfectly to his record. Then Jared greedily moved on to the commercial real estate portfolio. This was where his pure arrogance truly highlighted his profound ignorance. Dennis and I had spent 30 difficult years acquiring prime downtown real estate. We owned corner lots and massive office buildings that generated huge monthly leasing revenues. You do not just sell massive commercial properties like that overnight. You negotiate for months. You hold out for the premium corporate buyers. But Jared had absolutely no idea how the real estate business actually worked. He only saw immediate dollar signs. Maxwell watched in absolute disbelief as Jared listed 3 of our most profitable commercial lots on the open market. He used a cheap discount broker who asked 0 questions about the sudden transfer of deeds. He priced the valuable properties at 20% below the standard market value to guarantee a fast closing process. I was literally throwing away millions of dollars just to get his greedy hands on the immediate cash payouts. He wanted to liquidate the entire fake holding company portfolio before anyone could ever contest the hospice paperwork. He thought he was a financial genius executing a brilliant corporate takeover. He had no idea he was leaving a massive glowing paper trail of wire fraud and illegal property transfers. Every single contract he signed and every deed he transferred was adding another 5 years to his inevitable federal prison sentence. While Jared was busy playing the role of a ruthless corporate raider, his wife, Monica, was extremely busy playing the role of a billionaire socialite. I bought a cheap tablet device and created a blank social media profile just to quietly watch her public pages. She simply could not help herself. Greed is a very loud and obnoxious disease. She desperately needed the whole world to know she was suddenly living a wealthy lifestyle. Her daily internet posts were a masterclass in extreme arrogance. She posted a photo of herself holding a tall glass of expensive champagne while sitting casually on the leather hood of a brand new imported luxury sport utility vehicle. The caption under the picture read that the universe had finally rewarded their hard work with a beautiful early retirement. She added a dozen tags about living a blessed life and securing generational wealth. The very next day, she posted a long video touring a massive lake house property. She was bragging to the camera about paying cash for their new luxury summer home. She constantly showed off designer watches, custom diamond bracelets, and heavy shopping bags from exclusive stores where a single pair of shoes cost more than my first truck. But here was the most beautiful part of Monica's endless public vanity. Maxwell dug deep into the complex financing of those luxury vehicles and those designer shopping sprees. Jared and Monica did not actually have the liquid cash from the real estate sales yet. Those massive commercial property deals take at least 30 to 60 days to clear escrow and hit the bank. So how were they paying for the imported cars and the diamond bracelets right now? They were buying everything on massive lines of credit. Jared had taken the fraudulent legal documents for the shell company and marched straight into a private wealth bank. He used my stolen real estate portfolio as collateral to take out a massive bridge loan. He borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars against valuable assets he did not actually own. He signed legal bank documents swearing under penalty of perjury that he was the sole legal owner of the entire estate. Every single time, Monica swiped that new premium credit card to buy a designer handbag, she was spending stolen bank funds. They were digging a financial grave so incredibly deep that they would never see the sunlight again. I sat in my modest living room, surrounded by the empty cardboard boxes, and looked at the digital photos of Monica smiling next to her luxury car. I felt a cold sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. When foolish people are handed unearned wealth, they do not know how to respect it or protect it. They just consume everything in sight until they finally burst. Jared and Monica thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought they had successfully erased my brother's legacy and discarded me like useless old trash. They genuinely believed they were invincible. I slowly taped up another cardboard box, sealing it shut with a loud ripping sound. I was packing my house, but I was not moving into a cheap apartment on the edge of town like they wanted. I was packing up my old quiet life so I could step completely into the new one. The trap was fully set, and the bait was aggressively taken. The steel jaws were slowly closing around them, and they were just too busy drinking imported champagne to notice the sharp teeth. I just had to wait for the final piece of the puzzle to fall perfectly into place. I just had to wait for my arrogant nephew to invite his broken old uncle over for dinner. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from Arthur Maxwell, holding the warm cup of black coffee his assistant had brought me. For 3 days, I had been playing the part of the defeated old man packing up my house while my nephew publicly celebrated his stolen wealth. But inside this secure mahogany-paneled office, the facade was entirely gone. Today was the day we pulled back the curtain on the actual structure of our empire. Maxwell opened a thick combination safe built directly into the wall behind his desk. He did not pull out a digital file or a printed email. He pulled out a heavy-bound leather ledger that looked like it belonged in a museum. He set it down gently on the center of his immaculate desk. The gold-embossed lettering on the cover was faded, but I knew exactly what it said. It was the master ledger, the absolute core of everything my brother Dennis and I had built together. Bruce Maxwell said, his voice dropping to a low, serious timbre. When Dennis called me 20 years ago to set up the legal shield against that frivolous lawsuit, he made one thing absolutely clear. He told me that putting the entire commercial real estate portfolio solely into his name was a massive risk. He was not worried about you trusting him. He was worried about what would happen if something happened to him. He knew his son, Jared, was ambitious, but he also knew Jared lacked the fundamental character required to manage true wealth. Dennis knew that if he ever lost his mental faculties, or if he passed away unexpectedly, Jared would immediately try to seize total control and push you out. I nodded slowly, staring at the heavy leather book. That was my brother. Dennis was always the visionary. He could look at a vacant dirt lot and see a thriving 10-story office building. He could also look at his own son and see the exact cracks in the foundation. He loved Jared, but he was not blind to his flaws. Dennis knew that wealth, unearned wealth, acts like a powerful magnifying glass. It takes whatever is already inside a person and makes it 10 times larger. Dennis knew that if Jared ever got his hands on the empire, without earning it, the greed would completely consume him. So Maxwell continued opening the heavy cover of the ledger. We drafted a secondary layer of protection, a shadow structure that ran completely parallel to the public deeds and the standard corporate filings. We called it the Dead Man's Trust. It is an ironclad, impenetrable legal failsafe designed specifically for this exact nightmare scenario. I remembered the day we signed the documents. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, much like the day Dennis passed. We sat in this very office drinking cheap coffee from styrofoam cups, while Maxwell, who was just a hungry junior partner back then, explained the legal mechanics. We wanted a mechanism that would automatically trigger if anyone ever tried to steal the portfolio while we were vulnerable. Maxwell turned the thick parchment pages until he found the specific section. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began to read the dense legal terminology aloud. The Dead Man's Trust explicitly states that if any asset transfer deed modification or corporate restructuring is executed while Dennis is documented to be under severe medical duress, lacking full cognitive capacity, or suffering from a terminal incapacitating illness, that specific transfer is not just legally void. It acts as an immediate trigger. Maxwell paused, looking up from the heavy book. His eyes were sharp and predatory. The moment that trigger is activated, Bruce, the entire trust structure collapses inward. Every single commercial property, every liquid bank account, every vintage car, and every piece of residential real estate, including the house you currently live in, is instantly and irrevocably transferred into your sole legal ownership. The trust was designed to bypass probate entirely. It is an automatic financial guillotine. The sheer brilliance of my brother's foresight brought a sudden, unexpected sting of tears to my eyes. Even decades ago, Dennis was protecting me. He knew that if he was ever lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak or defend our legacy, someone would try to take advantage. He built a trapdoor into the very foundation of the empire, ensuring that the moment a thief tried to break in the floor would vanish beneath their feet. Jared thought he was a financial genius, I said, my voice raspy with emotion. He thought he could just bring a shady notary into a hospice room and force a dying man to sign a piece of paper. He thought that because he created a fancy-sounding shell company like KALE Holdings, he was legally untouchable. Maxwell let out a short, harsh laugh. Jared's arrogance is staggering, Bruce. The creation of that shell company is the exact mechanism that seals his fate. If he had simply waited for Dennis to pass away and tried to challenge the standard will in probate court, it would have been a messy, drawn-out battle. He might have even won a substantial settlement just to make him go away. But Jared was too greedy. He could not wait for the natural legal process. He had to have it all immediately. By forcing the transfer of assets into his fraudulent LLC while Dennis was actively dying, he perfectly activated the dead man's trust. So I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. What is our exact legal standing right now, Arthur? If the trust triggered the moment Jared forged that transfer, does he actually own anything he is currently selling? Absolutely nothing, Maxwell replied, tapping his expensive pen against the leather ledger. Every single transaction Jared has executed over the past 2 weeks is completely fraudulent. The vintage cars he sold, the commercial lots he listed at fire sale prices, the massive bridge loans he took out against the properties. He is signing legally binding documents claiming ownership of assets that officially belong solely to you. He is spending money borrowed against your collateral. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Jared was not just stealing from the estate anymore. He was actively committing massive federal fraud every single time he signed his name. He was digging a hole so deep he would never be able to climb out. We have him. Bruce Maxwell said, his voice tight with anticipation. The moment we file the triggering documents for the dead man's trust, the bank will immediately freeze the KALE Holdings accounts. The loans he took out will instantly default. The buyers of the commercial properties will realize they hold worthless forged deeds, and they will sue him into oblivion. And the federal authorities will have a beautifully documented paper trail of a man who committed wire fraud and elder abuse to steal a multi-million-dollar empire. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, letting the silence of the office settle around me. The pieces were all falling perfectly into place. Jared thought he had outsmarted the old carpenter. He thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. He had no idea that Dennis and I had built the entire board, and we were just waiting for him to make his final fatal move. I sat rigid in the heavy leather chair in Arthur Maxwell's office. The polished mahogany desk between us was covered in neatly stacked files, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotional storm raging inside me. 3 days had passed since the funeral. 3 days of packing my life into cardboard boxes, playing the part of the defeated, irrelevant old man. Maxwell leaned forward. His hands steepled, his sharp eyes focused on a specific document. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of impending revelation. He slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth wood. It was a copy of the KALE Holdings, LLC Incorporation document, the instrument Jared had used to steal our empire. Look at the signature, Bruce. Maxwell's voice was low, stripped of its usual corporate sheen, replaced by a cold, analytical edge. I picked up the paper. The signature at the bottom purported to be my brother's. Dennis's name was scrawled there, jagged and shaky, exactly the kind of mark you would expect from a dying man. But something was fundamentally wrong. I stared at the ink. I knew my brother's handwriting intimately. I had seen him sign thousands of checks, contracts, and blueprints over 40 years. Even when his hands began to tremble with age, there was a specific rhythm to his script, a certain heavy pressure on the first letter of his name. This signature, while a decent forgery, lacked that pressure. It was an imitation drawn by someone trying to replicate weakness, not someone actually experiencing it. Maxwell didn't wait for my analysis. He pulled another file, a thick medical dossier from the hospice facility. My team obtained these under an emergency subpoena related to the original trust. He explained, his tone clinical. These are the nurse's logs and the attending physician's daily notes for Dennis's final week. He opened the file to a page flagged with a red sticky note. Read the entry for Tuesday the 14th, he instructed. I scanned the dense medical terminology, my eyes zeroing in on the highlighted section. It documented a significant neurological decline. The notes indicated that by 2 p.m. on Tuesday, Dennis had lost all voluntary motor function in his right side, his dominant side. He was unable to grip a cup, let alone hold a pen. He was unresponsive to verbal commands and deeply sedated. Now, Maxwell said softly, look at the date and timestamp on the KALE incorporation documents. I shifted my gaze back to the forged signature. The notary stamp and the date next to Dennis's supposed signature were clearly visible. Thursday the 16th, 10 a.m. The air rushed out of my lungs. Thursday. My brother had been completely incapacitated, essentially paralyzed on his right side for 48 hours before this document was supposedly signed. The implication was horrific, far worse than a pressured signature. Jared hadn't just forced a dying man to sign a document. He had physically guided his father's limp, unresponsive hand, or simply forged the signature himself while a crooked notary watched, or perhaps the notary stamp was forged as well. It is a complete fabrication, Maxwell stated, leaning back in his chair. A clumsy, desperate fabrication. Jared forged the signature 2 full days after your brother lost all ability to move his dominant hand. It's not just duress, Bruce. It is outright fraud, forgery, and elder abuse documented in black and white. The anger I had been carefully suppressing flared hot in my chest. My hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. He violated his own father on his deathbed. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to drive straight to Jared's upscale suburban house, kick down his front door, and drag him out onto the street. I wanted to shove this medical file in his face and watch the smug arrogance drain from his eyes. I wanted to call the police right this second and hear the satisfying click of handcuffs locking around his wrists. Arthur, I said, my voice rough, vibrating with suppressed fury. We have the proof. We have the smoking gun. Call the authorities. Let's end this right now. Maxwell held up a hand, his expression calm and infuriatingly patient. Bruce, I understand your anger. It is entirely justified. But we need to think strategically, not emotionally. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto mine. If we go to the authorities right now, what happens? Jared gets arrested. He posts bail immediately using the funds he's already liquidated. He hires a team of ruthless defense attorneys. They argue the timeline. They question the medical records. They claim Dennis was having a brief moment of lucidity. They drag this out in probate court for 5 years. They drain the estate assets fighting us. It becomes a messy, public, drawn-out battle. I stared at him, the logic of his words slowly cutting through my rage. So what are you suggesting? We just let him get away with it. We let him hang himself, Maxwell said, a dangerous glint appearing in his eyes. Right now, Jared thinks he is invincible. He thinks he has completely outsmarted you and the entire legal system. He is moving fast, liquidating assets, taking out massive bridge loans against properties he doesn't actually own. He paused, letting the weight of his strategy sink in. Let him commit the fraud fully, Bruce. Let him sign the contracts. Let him transfer the deeds to those commercial buyers. Let him spend the money he is borrowing from the private wealth banks. Every time he signs his name to one of those documents claiming ownership of assets that legally belong to you under the dead man's trust, he is committing another federal crime. He is weaving a web of wire fraud, bank fraud, and illegal property transfers that no defense attorney in the country can untangle. The brilliance of the plan was chilling. Maxwell wasn't just planning to stop Jared. He was planning to completely obliterate him. We don't strike when he is vulnerable. Maxwell continued, his voice steady and cold. We strike when the damage is irreversible. We wait until he is fully leveraged, until he has spent millions. He doesn't have until the new buyers have taken possession of the properties. When we finally trigger the trust and reveal the forgery, the entire structure he built will instantly collapse. The banks will demand immediate repayment. The buyers will sue him for fraudulent conveyance. The federal authorities will have a mountain of irrefutable evidence. He won't just lose the inheritance, Bruce. He will lose his freedom, his reputation, and every cent he has ever possessed. I sat back in the chair, the anger slowly receding, replaced by a cold, resolute determination. It was a terrifying strategy, allowing a thief to steal from you in plain sight, trusting that the trap you laid would eventually snap shut. It required an immense amount of patience, a willingness to watch my brother's legacy be temporarily dismantled, piece by piece. But as I looked at the forged signature, the final violation of my brother's dignity, I knew Maxwell was right. A simple arrest wasn't enough. Jared needed to feel the absolute peak of his arrogance before the floor gave way. He needed to understand the true cost of his greed. "Okay, Arthur," I said, my voice steady. "We wait. We let him spend the money. We let him dig the hole." Maxwell nodded, a tight smile forming on his lips. "Excellent. In the meantime, you continue to play your part. Pack your house. Look defeated. Let him believe his plan is working perfectly. The more confident he is, the more mistakes he will make." I stood up, leaving the files on the desk. The image of the broken, irrelevant old man had returned, but beneath it, the architect was fully awake, watching the foundation of his nephew's stolen empire begin to crack. I walked out of the office, ready to return to the cardboard boxes and the performance of a lifetime. The silent war was escalating, and I was exactly where I needed to be. The sharp ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet dust of the living room. I was kneeling on the hardwood floor, sealing another brown cardboard box filled with old kitchen plates. My knees ached, a genuine reminder of my 70 years, but my mind was as sharp as a newly honed saw blade. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my flannel sleeve and picked up the phone from the kitchen counter. The screen glowed with the caller ID. It was Jared. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, slipping perfectly back into the character of the defeated old man. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello, Jared," I said, keeping my voice low and slightly raspy, as if the dust and the grief were finally suffocating me. "Uncle Bruce," Jared replied. His voice was dripping with a thick, artificial sweetness that immediately made my stomach turn. "I just wanted to check in on you. I know this transition has been incredibly hard. Packing up that old house must be taking a toll on you." "It is what it is," I mumbled, staring at the blank television screen across the room. "Well, Monica and I were talking," Jared continued, his tone shifting into something that sounded like rehearsed sympathy. "We feel terrible about how rushed everything has been since Dad passed. The funeral was a blur, and we never really got the chance to just sit down as a family. We want to fix that. We want to have you over for a nice farewell dinner tomorrow night before you move out. A family healing, you could say." I closed my eyes and smiled, a cold, hard smile to the empty room. The sheer audacity of the phrase was almost impressive. My nephew had stolen my brother's legacy, forged a dying man's signature, and served me an eviction notice at a funeral. Now he was inviting me to dinner to heal. But I knew Jared better than he knew himself. Greedy men do not offer free meals. There is always a hook hidden inside the bait. "That is very kind of you, Jared," I replied, injecting just the right amount of hesitant gratitude into my voice. "I am not sure I am great company right now, but a hot meal sounds nice." "Wonderful," Jared said, his relief palpable through the speaker. "Oh, and Uncle Bruce, just a minor. Since you are coming over anyway, I will have some final transition paperwork printed out. It is just some standard legal boilerplate for the estate closure. Nothing major, just tying up a few loose ends so you do not have to worry about any lingering liabilities with the property after you leave. We can knock it out before dessert." There it was. The hook. "Of course," I said, my voice completely docile. "Whatever you need to wrap things up. I will see you tomorrow at 7. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. I did not go back to packing the kitchen plates. I walked straight to the window and looked out at the street. Jared was getting nervous. He was moving millions of dollars in stolen commercial real estate, taking out massive bridge loans, and signing federal banking documents. Somewhere in that frantic web of fraud, a banker or a title insurance agent had likely asked him a very standard question. They had asked if there were any other surviving family members who might contest the estate transfers. Jared needed a guarantee. He needed an ironclad shield to show the banks that the old broke uncle was completely out of the picture. He needed me to sign a comprehensive liability waiver, permanently surrendering any and all rights to contest the Keystone Assets Legal Enterprises transfers. I picked up the phone again and dialed Arthur Maxwell's direct office line. He answered on the second ring. "Arthur," I said, my voice dropping back into its normal commanding register. "The invitation just arrived. Dinner tomorrow night at his house. He mentioned he has some minor transition paperwork for me to sign to tie up loose ends." I could practically hear Maxwell grinning through the receiver. "A liability waiver," Maxwell said smoothly. "It is exactly what we anticipated, Bruce. He is over-leveraged. He is borrowing against commercial properties he does not legally own, and the private wealth lenders are probably asking for indemnification forms regarding surviving relatives. He wants you to sign away your right to sue him for a few $1,000s in relocation money. He wants to bulletproof his fraud." He called it a family healing, I told Maxwell, shaking my head at the absolute absurdity of it. He thinks I am going to sit at his dining table, eat his food, and sign away my brother's entire life's work for pennies. Let him think exactly that. Maxwell advised, his tone shifting into pure strategic focus. "Bruce, this is the moment we have been waiting for. The fact that he is demanding a liability waiver means his fraudulent deals are reaching their absolute tipping point. The buyers are lining up, the loans are pending, and he needs your signature to close the loop. If you refuse to sign, he might panic and try to pull back. We cannot let him pull back. We need him fully exposed." "I am not going to sign anything, Arthur," I said firmly. "No, you are not," Maxwell agreed. "But you are going to go to that dinner. You are going to walk into his house looking like a man who has lost everything. You are going to let him slide that waiver across the table. You are going to let him make his insulting little speech about family and generosity. And then, Bruce, you are going to drop the hammer." Maxwell and I spent the next hour going over the precise details of the counterstrike. His team of forensic accountants had compiled everything. We had the medical logs from the hospice nurses proving Dennis was completely incapacitated and paralyzed on his right side, 48 hours before the fraudulent holding company documents were stamped. We had the digital records of Monica bragging about luxury purchases bought with stolen credit. We had the complete paper trail of the fire sale commercial listings. "I have the dossier completely bound and ready," Maxwell told me. "It is a masterpiece of undeniable evidence. I am sending my courier to drop it off at your house in 1 hour. When you walk into Jared's dining room tomorrow night, you keep that dossier out of sight until the exact right moment. You let him offer you the pen. You let him feel absolute victory. And then you show him exactly who built the empire he is trying to steal." "What about the authorities?" I asked, watching a delivery truck drive slowly past my front window. "I have already spoken with my contacts at the federal prosecutor's office," Maxwell said. "They have been quietly reviewing the wire fraud evidence we provided. Tomorrow night, while you are having dessert with your nephew, I will be sitting in a car down the street from his house with 2 federal agents. The moment you expose the truth to Jared, you call me. That will be the signal. We will walk up to the front door and end this nightmare." I thanked Arthur and ended the call. I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by the fake packing boxes I had been taping up for 2 weeks. The performance was almost over. Tomorrow night I would take off the mask. I walked down the hall to my bedroom and opened the closet door. Pushed far into the back, behind the faded flannel shirts and the worn-out denim work jackets, was a heavy garment bag. I unzipped it carefully. Inside hung a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. I had bought it 10 years ago for a major commercial ribbon-cutting ceremony, back when Dennis and I were actively managing the portfolio together. I had not worn it since. I ran my calloused hand over the fine wool fabric. Tomorrow night, I would not be wearing the flannel shirt of a defeated carpenter. I would not be slumping my shoulders or lowering my eyes. Tomorrow night, I was going to sit at my nephew's table, look him dead in the eye, and show him the terrible, crushing weight of the truth. I closed the closet door and walked back out to the living room, ready for the final confrontation. The sky was dark and clear when I turned my battered pickup truck into the sprawling gated community where Jared lived. The neighborhood was a maze of massive homes with perfectly manicured lawns and dramatic exterior lighting. These were houses built for people who wanted the world to know exactly how much money they had. I guided my rattling truck down the wide paved street and pulled into Jared's sweeping circular driveway. I parked directly behind Monica's brand new imported luxury sport utility vehicle. My rusted bumper practically touched her pristine license plate. It was a beautiful contrast. I stepped out into the crisp evening air. The previous night, I had unzipped a heavy garment bag and looked at a pristine, custom-tailored charcoal suit. I had fully intended to wear the armor of a wealthy executive to this dinner. But as I stood in my quiet living room, I realized that putting on the armor too early would ruin the illusion. If I walked up to Jared's front door looking like a powerful corporate titan, he would immediately raise his guard. He would suspect a trap. I needed him to be completely blind with his own arrogance when he handed me the liability waiver. So I left the custom suit in the closet. Instead, I wore an old moth-eaten brown jacket and a pair of faded dress pants that I had not worn since the late 90s. The sleeves were a fraction too short, and the fabric smelled faintly of old cedar and dust. I looked exactly like a man who had been thoroughly defeated by life. I walked up the sweeping brick pathway and rang the heavy brass doorbell. A moment later, the towering wooden door swung open to reveal Monica. She wore an elegant silk blouse and heavy gold jewelry that I knew for an absolute fact had been purchased using fraudulent credit lines secured by my real estate portfolio. Her smile was a masterclass in artificial pity. She tilted her head to the side and let out a soft, dramatic sigh as she looked at my wrinkled jacket and scuffed work boots. "Uncle Bruce," she cooed, her voice pitched high and sweet, as if she were speaking to a lost child. "Come in, please. Just be sure to wipe your boots on the mat so we do not stain the marble foyer." I shuffled inside, intentionally dragging my feet just a little bit to complete the pathetic picture. The house was cavernous and aggressively modern. The ceilings vaulted high above us, and the walls were covered in large abstract paintings that looked expensive but lacked any real substance. It was exactly the kind of house a greedy man buys when he wants to pretend he belongs to high society. Jared walked out of the formal living room to greet me. He wore a plush cashmere sweater and sharply tailored slacks. He held a heavy crystal wine glass in his right hand, gently swirling the dark red liquid inside. He looked at me, taking in the ill-fitting brown suit and the slumped posture. A look of profound, arrogant satisfaction washed over his face. He felt like a giant standing next to a beggar. "Uncle Bruce, I am glad you made the drive," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Let us head straight into the dining room. We decided to keep things very simple and casual tonight. Casual was the understatement of the century. I followed them into a massive formal dining room dominated by a long polished wood table. At the far end of the table, two elegant place settings were arranged with heavy silver cutlery and thick linen napkins. Between those two settings sat a dark, heavy bottle of imported red wine. I knew the vintage well, and I knew that specific bottle cost easily $300. Then I looked at the opposite end of the long table where they expected me to sit. There was no linen napkin. There was no silver fork. There was a thin white paper plate resting directly on the bare polished wood. Next to the paper plate was a flimsy plastic fork, still wrapped in clear cellophane. Sitting in the very center of the paper plate was a lukewarm aluminum takeout container from a cheap local diner down the highway. I stared at the paper plate for a long moment. It was the most deliberate and calculated visual insult I had ever experienced in my entire life. They were pouring $300 wine into crystal glasses for themselves, while serving me greasy takeout food on disposable paper. They wanted to physically demonstrate the massive, unbridgeable gap between their perceived wealth and my manufactured poverty. They wanted to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. I did not say a single word about the paper plate. I pulled out the heavy wooden dining chair and sat down, letting my posture slump forward. Jared took his seat at the head of the table, swirling his expensive wine. Monica sat gratefully beside him, adjusting her silk blouse. She did not offer to pour me a glass of wine. She did not even offer to get me a glass of tap water from the kitchen. "Eat up, Uncle Bruce," Jared said, gesturing casually toward my aluminum container with his crystal glass. "We figured you would not want anything too heavy or complicated at your age. Plus, you need to keep your energy up for the big move this week. Finding a cheap apartment on such short notice is a lot of hard work." I carefully peeled back the foil lid of my takeout container. The food was a lukewarm serving of greasy meatloaf and instant mashed potatoes. I picked up the flimsy plastic fork and took a slow, deliberate bite. "We actually spent some time looking up a few low-income senior housing facilities for you," Monica added, cutting a delicate piece of roasted duck on her porcelain plate. "There is a decent one near the interstate highway that accepts standard government pension checks. It is not exactly luxury living, but it will keep a roof over your head. We can print out the application forms for you before you leave tonight." "That is very thoughtful of you, Monica," I said, making my voice sound quiet and entirely submissive. "I appreciate you taking the time to look out for me." Jared smiled a wide, predatory grin that showed all of his teeth. He took a long, luxurious sip of his expensive, stolen wine. He was actively reveling in the absolute power dynamic of the room. He felt like a generous king feeding scraps to a desperate peasant. He truly believed he had completely broken my spirit. He believed I was a tired, ignorant old carpenter who was simply grateful to be allowed inside a warm house for a cold meal. The patronizing atmosphere in that dining room was so thick it was almost suffocating. But I sat there, and I chewed my cold food in absolute silence. I was letting them enjoy their final moments of perceived royalty. I was letting them drink their expensive wine and bask in their glorious arrogance because I knew exactly what was resting quietly inside the inner pocket of my old brown suit. I finished the last bite of the cold mashed potatoes and carefully placed the flimsy plastic fork down onto the paper plate. The silence in the formal dining room was thick and heavy, broken only by the soft clinking of Monica cutting her roasted duck with heavy silver cutlery. Jared took another slow sip of his imported red wine, savoring the vintage before carefully placing the crystal glass down on a decorative marble coaster. He leaned back in his luxurious dining chair and casually unbuttoned the top of his cashmere sweater. The time for pretending to care about my well-being was officially over. He was ready to conduct his business. He reached down into a premium leather briefcase resting on the floor beside his chair. He pulled out a thick manila folder and dropped it onto the polished wood table. The heavy thud of the paper echoed loudly in the large, empty room. He placed his hand flat on top of the folder and slowly slid it across the long table toward me. It stopped right next to my disposable paper plate. Then he reached into his pants pocket and pulled out a cheap, clear plastic pen, the kind you buy in bulk at a discount office supply store. He tossed it onto the table. It clattered against the expensive wood and rolled until it hit the edge of the folder. "Go ahead and open it, Uncle Bruce," Jared said, his voice returning to that flat, transactional tone he had used in the hospital hallway. "Like I mentioned on the phone, it is just some standard transition paperwork. We are finalizing the estate closure this week, and the lawyers want all the loose ends tied up neatly before the end of the month." I did not touch the folder right away. I looked at the cheap plastic pen resting against the thick stack of paper, and then I looked up at my nephew. His dark eyes were locked onto mine, projecting absolute authority and impatient entitlement. Monica had stopped eating completely. She was watching me with a tight, expectant smile, waiting for the poor old carpenter to blindly obey her wealthy husband. I slowly reached out with my rough, calloused hands and flipped open the heavy manila cover. Inside was a dense legal contract spanning at least 20 pages. It was printed in a tiny, intimidating font filled with corporate jargon and complex liability clauses. But I did not need to read the fine print to know exactly what it said. I had spent 30 years drafting and reviewing commercial real estate contracts that were 10 times more complicated than this amateur document. I skimmed the first paragraph, making sure my eyes widened slightly, as if the legal terminology was completely overwhelming my simple mind. I let my hands tremble just a fraction of an inch as I held the heavy pages up to the light. "This looks very complicated, Jared," I mumbled, letting confusion and fatigue coat my words. "I do not really understand what all of this legal language means. I just build cabinets. I do not know how to read corporate lawyer talk." Jared let out a soft, patronizing sigh. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, folding his hands tightly together. "It is a standard liability waiver," he explained, speaking very slowly and clearly, as if he were trying to explain a complex math problem to a very slow toddler. "It simply states that you acknowledge and accept the transfer of Dad's assets into the new holding company. It means you formally agree not to contest the Kale LLC transfers in probate court or file any frivolous lawsuits against the estate in the future. It protects Monica and me from any lingering legal headaches while we liquidate the portfolio." He paused, letting his words sink in before reaching back into his suit jacket. He pulled out a pristine paper check and slid it across the table, resting it precisely on top of the legal contract. "Now I know moving out of the house is going to put a serious strain on your limited finances." Jared continued, his voice dripping with artificial generosity. "Moving trucks and security deposits are expensive, especially on a fixed income. So Monica and I discussed it, and we want to help you out. We are family after all. If you sign that waiver right now acknowledging the asset transfers, I am going to give you this relocation stipend." I looked down at the paper check. It was made out to my name in the amount of $2,000. The signature at the bottom was Jared's, and the account name printed at the top belonged to Keystone Assets Legal Enterprises. I was trying to buy my silence using money he had actively stolen from my own commercial real estate portfolio. $2,000, I whispered, staring at the check as if it were a winning lottery ticket. I kept my voice shaky and full of manufactured awe. "I know it is extremely generous," Jared said, leaning back in his chair with a profoundly satisfied smirk. "But considering you have absolutely nothing to your name, and Dad is no longer here to subsidize your life, we felt it was the right thing to do. It is a fresh start, Uncle Bruce. $2,000 will easily cover the deposit on a small apartment on the edge of town. You can buy yourself some decent groceries and get settled without panicking about your pension checks bouncing." Monica chimed in, nodding her head vigorously. "You really should take the offer, Bruce. Jared is bending over backward to be accommodating to you. Most families would just let the bank foreclose and leave you to figure it out on your own out in the cold. You are very lucky he is looking out for your best interests." I sat perfectly still, looking at the cheap plastic pen, the dense fraudulent contract, and the insulting $2,000 check. Jared was trying to purchase a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire for the price of a used couch. He was so completely desperate to bulletproof his massive fraud that he actually believed this pathetic bribe would work. He needed my signature on that waiver to satisfy the private wealth bankers who were currently underwriting his massive bridge loans. Without my legal surrender, his entire house of cards was sitting on extremely unstable ground. I thought I was staring at the check because I was desperate. He thought the silence in the dining room was the sound of my broken pride finally surrendering to reality. He watched me with greedy, expectant eyes, waiting for me to pick up that cheap plastic pen and sign away my brother's entire legacy. He was absolutely convinced that he had won the war. I kept my head bowed for a long moment, letting the heavy silence stretch out until it became almost physically uncomfortable. I wanted him to savor this exact second. I wanted him to feel the absolute towering height of his false victory, so the inevitable fall would shatter every single bone in his arrogant body. I let my breathing slow down completely, dropping the facade of the frightened old man. "Are you sure about this, Jared?" I asked softly, my voice losing the raspy tremble and returning to a solid, steady baseline. "You are absolutely sure this is how you want to handle your father's estate?" Jared let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He took another sip of his expensive wine and waved his hand in the air. "I am completely sure, Uncle Bruce. Like I said before, it is just business. Now pick up the pen and sign the bottom line so we can all move on with our lives." I looked at the cheap plastic pen resting on the polished mahogany table. I did not pick it up. Instead, I reached slowly inside the deep inner pocket of my faded brown suit jacket. The time for packing cardboard boxes and eating cold meatloaf was officially over. I did not reach for the cheap plastic pen resting on the polished mahogany table. I let it sit there next to the fraudulent legal waiver, perfectly untouched. Instead, I slowly pulled my hand back and reached for the plain glass of tap water Monica had poured for me when I first arrived. The ice cubes clinked softly against the thin rim, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence that had settled over the formal dining room. I brought the cool glass to my lips and took a very slow, deliberate sip. I let the cold water wash away the taste of the greasy takeout food and the dry, bitter ash of playing the submissive victim for the past 3 weeks. I placed the glass back onto the bare wood surface, centering it perfectly next to my disposable paper plate. The physical act of taking that simple drink of water was the exact boundary line between my extended performance of defeat and the crushing reality of the present moment. Then the transformation began. I stopped hunching my shoulders forward to shave those extra inches off my height. I pushed my chest out and sat back deep into the heavy dining chair, letting my spine straighten to its full natural posture. The fabricated ache in my knees and the manufactured tremble in my hands seemed to evaporate completely into the thin air of the upscale room. I rolled my neck slightly, feeling the familiar satisfying tension release as my vertebrae settled into their proper alignment. For the first time since my brother passed away, I allowed the true physical presence of a man who had commanded massive construction crews and dominated fierce boardroom negotiations to fully occupy the space around me. I was no longer the frail, broken old carpenter sitting quietly at the wrong end of the table. I was the architect of the very empire. Jared was desperately trying to steal, and my shadow suddenly felt large enough to swallow the entire room. I lifted my chin and locked my eyes directly onto my nephew. The watery, fearful gaze of a dependent old uncle vanished without a single trace. My eyes hardened into the sharp, predatory focus of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a structural foundation piece by piece. I did not blink. I stared right through his smug, confident expression, peering straight into the weak, hollow core of his character. I watched the initial flicker of confusion ripple across his face. He leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing, as his brain struggled to process the sudden, profound shift in my physical energy. The pathetic, submissive dog he thought he had successfully cornered was suddenly staring back at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a wolf. Monica noticed the shift immediately. The self-satisfied smirk on her face faltered and died. She stopped cutting her expensive roasted duck and let her heavy silver fork drop against the porcelain plate with a loud clatter. She glanced nervously at her husband and then back to me, sensing that the absolute power dynamic in the room had just violently flipped upside down. The comfortable silence of their perceived victory was rapidly turning into the suffocating pressure of a trap snapping shut. She shifted uncomfortably in her luxurious dining chair, the heavy emerald necklace catching the ambient light as she swallowed hard against a sudden wave of apprehension. When I finally spoke, I completely dropped the raspy, trembling whisper I had been using for weeks to mask my true tone. My vocal cords relaxed, and my real voice filled the massive formal dining room. It was a deep, resonant baritone, a voice forged over decades, on loud construction sites, and in high-stakes financial meetings. It carried the absolute unyielding authority of a man who was used to giving orders and having them instantly obeyed without question. The sheer sound of it vibrated against the crystal wineglasses resting on the table. "That is a very generous offer, Jared," I said, letting my natural baritone wash over them. $2,000 is a considerable amount of money to hand over to a broke old carpenter. It shows a real profound commitment to family charity. Jared blinked rapidly, his confident facade cracking just a fraction more. He opened his mouth to reply, to reassert his dominance over the conversation, but the words completely died in his throat. The tone of my voice had completely paralyzed his thought process. He instinctively realized that he was no longer talking to the uneducated uncle he had dismissed for his entire life. He was looking at a complete stranger sitting inside my skin, wearing my old clothes. I leaned forward, resting my thick forearms on the polished mahogany table, mirroring the exact posture he had used to intimidate me just moments earlier. I kept my eyes perfectly locked onto his, watching the first genuine seeds of absolute panic take root in his mind. "But I think the Federal Bureau of Investigation will have a very different valuation of your new corporate enterprise," I said, keeping my delivery slow and measured. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Jared physically recoiled, pulling his back away from the table, as if the heavy wood had suddenly caught fire. The last remaining traces of his arrogant smirk melted right off his face, replaced by a mask of pale, wide-eyed shock. The imported red wine in his crystal glass trembled as his hand gripped the stem in sudden, unadulterated terror. I paused, letting the terrible weight of my statement stretch tightly between us before delivering the fatal blow. "I think they will find that Keystone Assets Legal Enterprises is worth exactly the amount of time you are going to spend inside a federal prison cell." I did not give him a single second to recover his breath. I kept my voice perfectly level and ruthlessly calm. "You thought you were so incredibly brilliant naming your fraudulent shell company after a healthy vegetable to trick the hospice nurses. You really thought that bringing a shady notary into a medical facility while your own father was completely incapacitated and paralyzed on his dominant side was a flawless master plan. You actually believed that sliding a pen into a dying man's hand would instantly make you a real estate mogul." Monica let out a sharp, terrified gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The stolen emerald necklace draped across her collarbone seemed to weigh her down as the blood completely drained from her cheeks. She looked at her husband with sheer panic, realizing that the foundation of their newly acquired wealth was completely exposed to the light of day. "You looked at me standing in that hospital hallway, and you saw an uneducated fool," I continued, my voice echoing in the vaulted dining room. "You saw a man who drove a rusted truck and wore faded flannel shirts. You assumed I was ignorant of the corporate structures, the complex banking regulations, and the massive bridge loans you have been illegally securing against commercial properties you do not actually own. You thought your 30-day eviction notice was a death sentence for my future." Jared sat completely frozen at the head of the table, staring at me as if I had just risen from the dead to drag him into the underworld. His mind was desperately trying to calculate how the pathetic old man eating cold meatloaf from a paper plate suddenly knew the exact name of his secret shell company and the precise medical condition of his father on the very day the fraudulent transfer documents were stamped. He was drowning in his own sudden realization of massive catastrophic failure. The illusion of his absolute power had been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I had stripped away his disguise with just a few sentences, and now he was completely naked in the face of his own crimes. The cheap plastic pen still rested on the polished wood table, completely ignored and entirely useless. The formal dining room was silent once again, but this time the silence belonged entirely to me. Jared was staring at the destruction of his own future, and I was just getting started. I reached deep into the oversized inner pocket of my moth-eaten brown jacket. The bulky fabric had perfectly concealed what I brought with me. I pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier. It was packed tight with certified copies and bank records representing the absolute sum of my retaliation. I did not place it down gently. I raised it a few inches above the polished mahogany wood and let it drop. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted dining room. The corner of the thick leather binding slammed directly into the base of Monica's delicate crystal wine glass. The glass tipped over, instantly shattering the quiet tension of the room. A wave of dark, expensive red wine spilled across the pristine table. The liquid spread out rapidly, soaking into my cheap paper plate and creeping directly toward Jared's fraudulent liability waiver. Monica shrieked and jumped back from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She desperately clutched her silk blouse, trying to avoid the sprawling red stain, but neither Jared nor I looked at the spilled wine. We were completely locked onto each other. I reached across the expanding puddle of wine and flipped open the heavy leather cover of the dossier. I pulled out the very first document and tossed it right in front of Jared. It was a high-resolution enlargement of the Keystone Assets, Legal Enterprises Incorporation papers, specifically focusing on the bottom line. "Look at that signature, Jared," I commanded, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Look at the way the ink pools at the bottom of the letters. Your father was a master draftsman. I watched him build those office plazas from the dirt up. I knew the strength in his hands. He held a pen like a precision tool, with a heavy, deliberate pressure on the initial downward stroke. He signed his name with a rigid mechanical rhythm for 50 years. I leaned forward, pointing at the forgery. But the signature on that paper has absolutely no pressure. It is light and shaky in all the wrong places. It is the signature of a terrified amateur trying to trace over a memory. You tried to replicate the signature of a giant using the trembling hands of a coward. You did not even have the skill to forge his name properly. You just scribbled it in a panic while he lay dying in a hospital bed. Any forensic handwriting expert will testify that this is a complete and total forgery. You left it a trail of crumbs leading directly to your own guilt." Jared stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing in complete silence. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face for 3 weeks was entirely gone. I did not give him a chance to formulate a single lie or attempt to build a defense. I pulled out the next document and slapped it down on top of the first one, letting it splash slightly in the spilled wine. "This is the sworn affidavit from the private notary you hired," I said, watching the last drop of color drain from his cheeks. "You thought paying a shady notary $500 in a cash envelope would buy their permanent silence. You thought they would risk a federal prison sentence for a local hustler pretending to be a real estate mogul. The moment my attorney contacted their office and mentioned federal wire fraud, the notary completely broke down and surrendered their entire logbook to us." I tapped the paper, emphasizing every word. "The notary confessed everything, Jared. They detailed exactly how you brought the pre-signed papers into their office. They admitted that you claimed your father was waiting in the car because he was too weak to walk inside. They admitted to stamping a document without ever verifying the identity or the consent of the signer. Your fraudulent stamp is perfectly documented. Thursday the 16th at exactly 10 in the morning. You had the documents officially stamped and certified, verifying that Dennis was present, coherent, and actively consenting to the total transfer of his entire corporate real estate portfolio into your dummy corporation. You assumed the old carpenter uncle would just fade away into the background without asking a single question." Jared started to shake. His chest was heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his exposure was crashing down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. But I was not finished. The final structural support of his lie needed to be completely eradicated. I reached into the dossier one last time and pulled out a thick stack of medical files printed on pale green hospital paper. I dropped them directly onto the table right in front of his trembling hands. "And this, Jared, is the absolute nail in your coffin," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet whisper. "These are the certified attending physician notes, and the hourly nursing logs from the hospice care facility. They outline every single medication, every single physical response, and every single heartbeat of your father during his final week on Earth. Let me tell you exactly what the entry says for Thursday the 16th, at 10 in the morning, the exact moment you claim he signed your papers. I leaned over the table, getting so close to him, I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath and the nervous sweat beading on his forehead. Patient is completely unresponsive. I recited from memory, my voice hard and unforgiving. Patient is under heavy palliative sedation, including maximum doses of intravenous morphine. Patient has experienced total neurological failure and complete paralysis on the right dominant side of his body. I paused, letting those medical facts hang in the air, like a death sentence. Your father was completely comatose, Jared. He was paralyzed on his right side for 2 full days before you supposedly watched him sign that legal document. He could not open his eyes. He could not lift a finger to scratch his own face. He could not even swallow a drop of water. Yet you stood in front of a notary and legally declared that he was sitting up, holding a pen, and willingly signing away a multi-million-dollar commercial empire to his son. You did not just forge a corporate document. I continued, the righteous anger bleeding into my words. You completely violated the final sacred moments of your own father's life. You turned his deathbed into a cheap crime scene. While his body was failing and his spirit was trying to find peace, you were busy manipulating his lifeless hand to steal money you never earned. You treated his dying breath as nothing more than a business transaction. Monica began to sob loudly behind him, her hands covering her face as the absolute reality of their impending destruction finally set in. She was no longer the proud socialite posting pictures of luxury cars. She was a terrified accomplice to a massive federal crime, realizing she was going to lose absolutely everything. Jared was physically shaking now, his hands trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. His knuckles were bone white. You thought you could bury me under a mountain of legal jargon and a cheap relocation check, I told him, standing up to my full height. You thought you could erase my name from the history of this family and take all the credit for decades of our blood and sweat. The arrogant corporate raider had vanished entirely, leaving behind a terrified, pathetic little boy caught in the middle of a massive, inescapable lie. The dining room felt like it was spinning out of control for them. But for me, everything was finally perfectly still. I had laid out the entire trap, and they had stepped right into the center of it with their eyes wide open. Jared simply refused to accept the catastrophic reality unfolding in his formal dining room. I watched his dark eyes dart wildly around the vaulted space, searching desperately for an escape hatch that did not exist. He swallowed hard, his throat working nervously as he leaned his hands against the edge of the mahogany table. He tried to project a menacing physical shadow, but his arms were shaking so violently that the entire heavy dining table vibrated. "You are bluffing!" He spat out, his voice cracking and rising like a terrified teenager. He pointed a trembling finger at the leather dossier resting in the puddle of spilled red wine. "You printed those fake medical logs from the internet. You mocked them up in your garage. You are a broke carpenter, Bruce. You hammer nails into cheap plywood for a living. You cannot afford a high-powered corporate lawyer to dig up hospice records and subpoena private notaries. You do not have a single dime to your name to fight me in court." Monica let out a pathetic whimpering sound from her side of the table. She grabbed Jared by the sleeve of his luxurious cashmere sweater, tugging at it frantically. "Jared, stop!" she pleaded, her voice a high-pitched squeal of pure, unadulterated panic. "He knows everything. Look at the hospital papers, Jared. They are real and certified. We are going to go to federal prison." She was completely unraveling, terrified of the criminal sentences that were suddenly looming over her entirely fabricated wealthy lifestyle. But Jared forcefully yanked his arm away from his weeping wife. He was completely blinded by his own frantic denial. He had spent his entire life looking down on me, and his fragile artificial ego simply could not process the fact that the pathetic old uncle had completely and utterly outsmarted him. I am the managing director of Keystone Assets, he shouted, his voice echoing off the tall ceilings. I have the signed deeds in my safe. I have the bank loans. I have the power. You are just a bitter old man trying to extort me for a slightly larger relocation check. I did not raise my voice to match his hysterical shouting. True power never needs to yell to be completely understood. I reached calmly into the inner breast pocket of my faded brown suit jacket. I bypassed the interior lining where I kept my old leather wallet and slipped my calloused fingers into a hidden tailored pocket. I pulled out a solid metal premium corporate platinum card. It was remarkably heavy, cold, and sleek. The dark matte finish caught the ambient light of the expensive crystal chandelier hanging above us. I held it casually between my index and middle fingers, letting the thick metal catch Jared's frantic eye. I slowly extended my arm over the expanding puddle of expensive wine and let the card slide from my grip. The heavy metal card landed directly on top of the fraudulent liability waiver, right next to the cheap plastic pen he had tossed at me earlier. The sharp metallic clink against the polished wood echoed in the desperately silent room. Jared stopped shouting instantly, as if the air had been violently sucked right out of his lungs. His wide eyes dropped to the heavy metal card. He stared at the silver-embossed lettering glowing against the dark, matte background. He read the name of the premier global financial institution printed perfectly at the top. Then he read the corporate entity engraved directly below it. It did not say a fake shell company name like his amateur operation. It named the exact massive holding conglomerate that his father had supposedly owned entirely on his own, and right beneath that corporate title in crisp, bold letters was my exact name. He stared at the physical card as if it were a live explosive device ready to detonate in his face. His brain finally began to process the crushing reality of the solid metal object resting on his dining table. Only top-tier executives with 8-figure liquid asset portfolios qualified for an exclusive corporate card like that. You do not get a heavy metal premium platinum card from hammering nails into cheap wood and collecting a meager monthly pension. I built the estate, Jared. I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devastating. I did not just work for your father doing odd jobs. I was his absolute equal partner. I was the silent architect who drafted the commercial blueprints, scouted the profitable downtown lots, and successfully negotiated the complex municipal zoning laws. We built that multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio together, block by concrete block. I just let your father hold the legal title decades ago to effectively shield our massive wealth from a ridiculous and frivolous lawsuit. I intentionally drove a rusted pickup truck and lived quietly in a modest residential house because I never needed to show the world how much money I actually possessed. Real wealth is entirely silent, Jared. Only desperate, deeply insecure little boys need to wear custom suits and drink imported wine to prove they have any real value to society. Jared sank slowly back into his luxurious dining chair, all the remaining strength completely leaving his rigid body. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He was finally looking at the real man sitting across the table from him, and the profound realization was physically crushing him. But your father was a brilliant and practical man. I continued, stepping ruthlessly into the absolute silence of the room. He knew exactly what kind of greedy, entitled child he had unfortunately raised. He knew that if he ever lost his mental faculties or lay dying in a hospital bed, you would immediately try to swoop in and steal the entire empire without earning a single honest dime of it. So 20 years ago, we drafted a secondary ironclad legal safety net called the Dead Man's Trust. I leaned forward, resting my heavy weight against the polished table. I locked my eyes onto his, watching his entire fabricated world crumble into absolute dust. The trust explicitly stated that if any assets were ever transferred under extreme medical duress, severe physical incapacity, or outright forgery, the entire commercial portfolio would automatically and irrevocably revert to my sole legal ownership. Do you understand what that means right now, Jared? It means that by forcing a pen into your dying father's paralyzed hand, you did not successfully steal a real estate empire. You triggered a massive, inescapable legal failsafe. Your clumsy, desperate forgery just legally forfeited your entire inheritance forever. You own absolutely nothing. The profound silence that followed my words was absolute and defining. There were no more arrogant smirks or condescending laughs. There were no more patronizing offers of $2,000 relocation checks or fake speeches about family healing. Jared just stared blankly at the heavy corporate platinum card resting mockingly on his fake legal documents. His mind was rapidly calculating the sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin. The massive bridge loans he had illegally taken out to buy his wife's diamond jewelry and imported luxury cars were instantly defaulting at that very second. The commercial real estate deeds he had illegally transferred at fire sale prices were entirely fraudulent. The buyers would demand their money back immediately. He had built a massive towering house of cards based on pure greed, and with a single calm breath, I had blown the entire structure straight to the ground. I was completely bankrupt, massively in debt, and fully exposed to severe federal criminal charges that carried decades of prison time. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands, and watching his eyes gloss over with pure, irreversible defeat. The performance of the broken old carpenter was officially over, and the silent adjustment was completely executed. The profound silence in the formal dining room was so absolute that I could hear the erratic, ragged breathing coming from my nephew. Jared was completely paralyzed, sitting in his luxurious chair, staring blankly at the heavy corporate platinum card resting on the table. The massive fortress of his stolen wealth had just evaporated, leaving him entirely exposed. Monica was still weeping softly into her hands, the reality of their catastrophic financial ruin crashing over her. Neither of them moved a single muscle. They were completely trapped in the suffocating gravity of their own greed. Then a sound sliced through the heavy tension of the room. It was the sharp, melodic chime of the heavy brass doorbell echoing loudly through the vaulted foyer. The sound was bright and cheerful, a sickening contrast to the absolute devastation unfolding at the dining table. Jared flinched violently, as if the sound had physically struck him. His wide, panicked eyes darted toward the grand entrance of his house. He looked at me, his face pale and slick with a cold, nervous sweat. I was desperately waiting for me to tell him it was just a neighbor or a delivery driver dropping off a package. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply sat back in my chair, resting my hands on my lap, and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "I think your dessert has finally arrived, Jared," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely hollow. "You should probably go answer your front door. It is incredibly rude to keep your guests waiting out in the cold night air." Jared pushed himself up from the dining table. His legs were shaking so badly he had to grip the back of his chair just to keep from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. He stumbled out of the dining room, walking like a man marching toward the gallows. I remained perfectly seated at my paper plate, listening to his heavy, dragging footsteps echo across the imported marble tiles of the foyer. I heard the heavy wooden door slowly creak open. The voice that drifted into the house did not belong to a friendly neighbor. It was the sharp, crisp, and entirely professional tone of my private wealth attorney, Arthur Maxwell. "Good evening, Jared," the lawyer said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man holding all the winning cards. "I apologize for interrupting your family dinner, but we have some extremely urgent estate business that requires your immediate attention." I stood up from the table, leaving the cheap plastic fork and the fraudulent legal waiver behind. I walked slowly out of the dining room and stepped into the grand foyer to watch the final act of this tragedy unfold. Arthur Maxwell was standing perfectly straight on the front porch, wearing a pristine dark suit, holding a thick leather briefcase. But he was not standing alone. Flanking him on either side were three men wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their chests. They were not smiling. They were looking at Jared with the cold, calculating stare of predators who had just cornered their prey. The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of folded papers from his jacket pocket. Jared, he said, his voice loud enough to fill the entire cavernous house. We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for this property and all associated digital devices. We also have federal arrest warrants for you and your wife, Monica. You are being officially charged with multiple counts of severe wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and aggravated elder abuse. Jared physically stumbled backward, completely overwhelmed by the crushing reality of the federal badges and the severe criminal charges. The last remaining trace of his arrogant corporate raider persona shattered into a million invisible pieces. He raised his trembling hands defensively, shaking his head in absolute frantic denial. There has to be a mistake, he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. I am the legal managing director of the estate. I have the signed paperwork. My father gave me the company. You cannot arrest me for managing my own family business. Monica had followed me out of the dining room and was standing near the edge of the marble foyer. When she heard the federal agent read the severe criminal charges and mention her name, the last thread of her composure completely snapped. The illusion of the perfect wealthy couple facing the world together instantly evaporated. When greedy people are finally cornered by the absolute consequences of their actions, loyalty is the very first thing they throw away to save themselves. Monica lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at her husband. I had absolutely nothing to do with this, she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, echoing violently off the tall ceilings. It was entirely his idea. He was the one who was obsessed with the money. He forced his father to sign those papers in the hospice room. I told him it was a terrible idea, but he would not listen to me. Do not arrest me. I am just his wife. I did not sign any of those fraudulent bank loans. Jared whipped his head around, staring at his wife in pure, unadulterated shock. The ultimate betrayal was happening right in front of his eyes. You bought a luxury imported car yesterday, Monica, he shouted back, his panic transforming into desperate, vicious anger. You posted pictures of diamond bracelets on the internet all week. You loved spending the money. You were the one who told me to hire the private notary. You told me to pay him cash in the parking lot to keep his mouth shut. You are just as guilty as I am. I did not hire the notary. Monica shrieked hysterically, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. You forged the corporate seal, Jared. You held your dying father's hand and forced the pen across the paper. You lied to the bankers. I am a victim here. He manipulated me just like he manipulated his poor uncle. It was a pathetic and miserable display of absolute cowardice. They were standing in the grand foyer of their luxurious suburban fortress, viciously tearing each other apart, trying to throw the person they supposedly loved under a speeding train just to avoid wearing federal handcuffs. The alliance of greed that had given them so much false confidence was completely destroyed in less than 60 seconds. They were fighting over the scraps of a sinking ship. The federal agents did not care about their domestic screaming match. The lead agent stepped firmly into the house, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed Jared by the arm, twisting him around and forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the cuffs locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 25 years. Another agent moved swiftly toward Monica, instructing her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging the agents to listen to her, pleading for mercy that she absolutely did not deserve. I walked quietly past them as they were being read their federal rights. I stopped next to Arthur Maxwell, who was watching the arrests with a quiet, satisfied nod. I reached out and shook my attorney's hand. I looked back at Jared one last time. He was staring at the marble floor, completely broken and entirely ruined. I did not offer him a single word of parting advice or a final gloating insult. True power is walking away from the wreckage you orchestrated without needing to look back. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, leaving the false king and his collapsing castle far behind me. 6 months have passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated that sprawling suburban driveway. The bitter winter cold has finally surrendered to a bright and clear spring morning. The heavy, suffocating fog of deception has completely lifted from my life, leaving behind a profound and absolute clarity. Arthur Maxwell and his dedicated team of corporate attorneys moved with ruthless and surgical efficiency in the days following the arrests. Keystone Assets, Legal Enterprises was completely dismantled and permanently erased from the state registry in a matter of a few short weeks. It was pulled apart brick by brick until nothing remained but a towering mountain of highly documented federal evidence. The massive bridge loans my nephew took out were immediately recalled by the furious private wealth bankers. The fraudulent commercial real estate listings were permanently canceled, and the buyers who thought they were securing a fire sale deal quietly walked away without a single complaint. The entire towering house of cards simply collapsed into a fine cloud of dust. Jared did not get the long, drawn-out legal battle he truly thought his cleverness deserved. When the federal prosecutors presented the undeniable hospice medical logs, alongside the sworn testimony of the private notary, his expensive defense attorneys immediately advised him to surrender. There was no grand dramatic trial or passionate courtroom speech. He pleaded guilty to severe wire fraud, aggravated forgery, and federal elder abuse. The judge was not moved by his fake tears or his pathetic excuses about financial pressure. The man who used to wear custom-tailored cashmere sweaters and drink imported red wine is now serving an 8-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. He wears a standard-issue uniform and sleeps on a thin mattress in a tiny concrete room. His wealthy suburban friends and his elite business associates completely abandoned him the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. All of his towering arrogance has been stripped away, leaving only a deeply hollow and terrified man who finally understands the absolute crushing weight of real consequences. He spends his days following strict orders from prison guards, learning exactly what it means to be truly powerless. Monica did not fare much better in the harsh light of reality. When the federal agents froze all their bank accounts, she quickly discovered that the luxurious life she had been broadcasting to the world was entirely financed by stolen money. The imported luxury sport utility vehicle she proudly posed with on the internet was promptly repossessed by the bank right out of her paved driveway. The massive credit card debts she accrued, buying designer handbags and expensive emerald jewelry, fell entirely onto her shoulders. She declared total personal bankruptcy less than 2 months after the dramatic arrest. The woman who once mocked me for wearing faded flannel shirts and eating cold meatloaf from a paper plate is now working double shifts as a cashier at a local discount retail store just to pay off her massive legal fees and court-ordered restitution. She lives in a tiny, cramped apartment and takes the public transit bus to work every single morning. She was forced to delete all her social media profiles to hide from the overwhelming public shame and the relentless mockery of the people she used to look down upon. Her soft hands are now calloused from working long physical hours, ringing up cheap merchandise for the very people she once considered completely beneath her. I spend my mornings going over the genuine corporate ledgers with Arthur Maxwell, ensuring that every single commercial property and bank account is perfectly secured and legally protected. The transition was smooth and seamless, just as the original Dead Man Trust intended. My brother Dennis built an incredible and lasting legacy, and I am making absolutely certain that it will never be threatened by greed again. The silent war is officially over, and the empire we built together is entirely safe. The people who tried to manipulate the dying breaths of a good man have been completely removed from our family history. I no longer have to pretend to be a weak, defeated old carpenter, shuffling my feet and bowing my head. I stand up straight, and I walk through the heavy glass doors of my downtown commercial buildings with the quiet, steady pride of a man who knows exactly what he built and exactly what it is worth. The air in my lungs feels lighter, and the quiet rooms of my house no longer feel like a trap waiting to be sprung. I sit on my front porch and watch the wind rustle the leaves of the old oak tree, feeling a deep and abiding peace that can only come from knowing the absolute truth has finally prevailed. I sit on the worn wooden steps of my front porch, wrapping my hands around a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. The early morning sun is just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the neighborhood. The old oak tree in my front yard rustles gently in the cool breeze, dropping a few stray leaves onto the damp grass. This is the exact same porch where my nephew expected me to sit and weep. This is the exact same house he tried to evict me from with a cheap piece of paper and a heart full of unearned arrogance. He thought 30 days would be the end of my story. He had no idea it was merely the beginning of his absolute ruin. Today, the house is quiet, but it is a comfortable and deeply peaceful quiet. There are no cardboard boxes stacked in my living room. There is no fake limp in my step or manufactured tremble in my hands. I take a slow, deep breath of the crisp morning air and let it out slowly, feeling the profound weight of the past few months finally lift off my shoulders. The empire my brother Dennis and I built from the dirt up is entirely secure. The assets are locked down. The commercial properties are thriving, and the legacy we forged with our own blood and sweat remains completely untarnished by the temporary stain of human greed. Yesterday afternoon, I sat down in the downtown corporate office with Mr. Maxwell to sign the final transition documents. But we were not signing papers to hide money or build fraudulent shell companies. We were establishing a massive philanthropic organization. We named it the Dennis and Bruce Foundation for the Trades. It is a fully funded endowment designed specifically to provide full scholarships and top-tier equipment to young men and women who want to learn how to build things with their own two hands. We are going to build vocational schools and fund apprenticeship programs across the entire state. Dennis was a master craftsman before he became a commercial real estate titan. He loved the smell of fresh-cut sawdust and the honest exhaustion that comes after a long day of physical labor. He believed that building a solid foundation was the most important thing a person could do in life. I know that looking down on this new foundation, he is incredibly proud. His true memory will not be tied to a fake corporate entity or a hospital bed forgery. His memory will live on in the hands of thousands of young builders who will carry our honest trade into the bright future. As I watch the neighborhood slowly wake up around me, I cannot help but reflect on the absolute absurdity of everything that transpired. My nephew looked at me and saw nothing but a faded flannel shirt and a pair of scuffed boots. He looked at my simple, quiet life and mistook my profound contentment for financial failure. He truly believed that because I did not shout about my wealth from the rooftops, I must not possess any at all. But that is the greatest illusion of the modern world. True wealth is never loud. It does not need to wear a custom-tailored suit or drive an imported luxury car to prove its existence to strangers. True wealth is entirely silent. It is the quiet, unshakable confidence of knowing exactly what you are capable of and never needing the validation of empty people to prove your worth. And true family, I have learned through extreme pain, is absolutely not defined by shared blood or a common last name. Blood merely makes you related by circumstance. True family is defined entirely by mutual respect, by unyielding loyalty, and by the unconditional willingness to protect one another when the severe storms of life inevitably hit. Jared shared my brother's blood, but he possessed absolutely none of his spirit. He chose the path of a thief rather than the path of a loving son. He let his ambition rot his soul, and he paid the ultimate price for his profound lack of character. They thought I was just an old fool they could easily step over on their way to the bank. They thought my silence was weakness and my patience was ignorance. They completely forgot one fundamental rule of life. You never try to collapse a building while the original architect is still standing inside the room. They forgot that the man who pours the concrete and builds the house knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are hidden. He knows every hidden flaw, every structural weakness, and exactly how much pressure to apply to bring the entire roof crashing down on the heads of the very people trying to steal it. I did not need to raise my voice to destroy my nephew. I just needed to let him build his kingdom of lies and then calmly remove the single pillar holding it all together. If there is one absolute lesson to be taken from this entire ordeal, it is that you should never underestimate the quiet observer sitting in the corner of the room. Arrogance is a blinding disease that tricks greedy people into believing they are invincible right up until the moment the trap closes around them. Patience will always defeat impulsive greed. When you live your life with genuine honesty and protect your boundaries with quiet strength, no amount of manipulation can ever permanently tear you down. The truth is a relentless force of nature, and it will always find its way into the light. Thank you for listening to my story today, and please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories about people finding the courage to stand up and protect what truly belongs to them.